Isaiah is going to be our main lesson in talking about this pre-exile environment. We're going to be talking about Jeremiah next week, hopefully, if all things go well. And then we're going to spend some time with the post-exile people and talking about what leadership looks like in a world where a foreign king has dominion and power over the people of God. It's different, it looks different, it feels different, but it's very relatable because it's where we are in our world and the circumstances that we fall into. And so we're going to spend some time with that. It's going to be really good. So let's go ahead and dig into Isaiah itself. So Isaiah was obviously this faithful prophet. We don't know a tremendous amount about his life other than he was indeed a prophet, and we have this whole book dedicated to him. He is called to be the prophet towards the end of the kings, and so we're going to see the end of the kings. And if you remember the storyline, we have the northern kingdom now and the southern kingdom. There has been a great divide between the kingdoms and some disputes between the kings. And so which of the kingdoms had the most faithful kings? That's not the best way to word that, but you understand what I'm saying. So which of the kingdoms, the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom, had the kings that were most faithful? Which one? It was the southern kingdom, right? Because what happens to all the kings of the northern kingdom? They're all unfaithful kings for the most part, with some glimmer of hope here and there, but we hear a lot of they turned away from the way of the Lord. They worshiped in the high places. They did not tear down the idols, so on and so forth. And so we see a lot of that, but we have some hope in the southern kingdom that seems to give us a little bit of a light that says, there's still some hope for the people of God. But nonetheless, we have a lot of unfaithful kings. So Assyria is going to come, and it's basically going to take the northern kingdom of itself, what we call the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And so that whole area is going to be taken by Assyria. And we're going to have the southern kingdom is the only thing that's going to be left for a period of time. And Isaiah is going to be present and speaking to this group of people. And so we're going to be talking about that. So Assyria for the northern, then Babylon's going to come along, and they're going to take over, and all of Israel will be taken into captivity. When a nation looks to God, this is one of the messages that I believe is glaring at us as we read through Isaiah, that when a nation looks to God for what they need, right, for protection and provision, when a nation looks to God instead of looking to the king for what they need. And there's a contrast here in a lot of areas where the people they'll look to the king for what they need, for support and supply, for protection, and instead of God. And so when the nation begins to do that, and the king is put in a place where he has to provide protection, support, and supply, most often in that circumstance, if the king becomes prideful, and from what we've studied so far about people who end up in leadership, how likely is it that a king is going to become prideful? Is it fairly unlikely? I mean, it's pretty likely, right? I mean, in a lot of cases when we see people get into that position of power, they really take on that role. They think themselves to be the protector and the supplier and the one who gives support. And that happens so often in the text. And so when the people begin to look to the king, there is another unfortunate circumstance or unfortunate result of that. The weakest of the kingdom suffer. It just seems to be a common thread that we see. When the king becomes the one who's in control instead of God, when he becomes the one who is providing the people protection and supply and support, when he becomes the one that people look to, more often than not, the weakest people of a nation start suffering. And I think the reason that is, there's a couple of reasons probably. We can think through different reasons why the weakest people could suffer. But I think in a lot of cases, it's because the king himself has a desire to look good. He wants his nation to look good. He wants his nation to look powerful. And when you're looking at a nation and you've got a bunch of impoverished people, does that look powerful? It looks weak. And so there's a sense in which those people have to have either a place or they have to be removed in the mind of an earthly king. Now, in contrast to God's kingdom, what does God want the poorest of a nation to be? Where does he want them to be, and what does he want to happen to them? What is his plan for the poor in the nation? What do y'all think? To be cared for, right? To be taken care of. And the reason that a nation like Israel can take care of their poor without losing control, without losing power, without losing anything, is because the earthly king is not really their sole king, not really their provider, not really their support, not really their supplier, not their protector. But who is their protector? And if God can supply all things and protect over all enemies and take care of the people in all circumstances, then the people are free to take care of one another and care for the needs of one another. But when we see the king putting himself, or the people putting the king in that place, this is bad leadership, this is bad examples of leadership, then the people themselves suffer. The weaker people in the nation are oppressed. And what does God think about a nation that oppresses the poor? Is he happy with that? Oh, he's very, very angry. In fact, when we read through the Old Testament, more often, when we see a nation start to oppress the poor, it's a sign that they have made some horrible, horrible decisions in leadership, and God is going to be extraordinarily angry with them. And that's one of the main messages of Isaiah. Isaiah's message is judgment. But it's not just judgment, okay? Because every time Isaiah presents judgment, he equally presents what? What do you think? Hope. It's a message of judgment and hope coupled together, right? And just kind of before we read the text, we're going to be in Isaiah chapter 3, verses 1 and 3. I want you to think about this just for a minute before we read this, because I think it's really important. When a people who are in a nation that oppresses the poor, that's kind of a sign that they've gone the wrong direction, they've left God, they're not doing the will of God. When a nation begins to oppress the poor, there will always be this remnant that desires to be faithful to God. And they're going to be stuck right in the middle of the judgment. Judgment's coming upon the nation. They're going to suffer. They're going to have difficulties as well. But when it comes to that kind of judgment, when God judges a nation and the remnant is in the midst of the nation, they will certainly experience difficulties. But is it ultimately good or bad for the remnant that God is judging the people? What do you think? Is it good? It doesn't feel good, right? It never feels good. And I'm sure that a lot of these people, the remnant, the ones who are faithful to God, even Isaiah, when we talk about Ezekiel, we'll talk about his faithfulness. I'm sure they did not like the idea that they were being run out of their home. They didn't like the idea that Assyria and Babylon are conquering them. It didn't feel good to go into Babylonian captivity. But in the end, it is good for them. Because ultimately, God's judgment has to take place in order for hope to become a reality. So judgment was necessary to abolish the problem and raise up victors in the midst. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move along. So Isaiah chapter 3. It says this. This is kind of a condemnation on the leaders of Israel. He says, "For behold, the Lord God of hosts is going to remove from Jerusalem and Judah." Now listen, remember what the people are looking for. They're looking to the king for supply and support. But look what God says. He's going to remove from Jerusalem and Judah both supply and support. The whole supply of bread, the whole supply of water. So as the people are looking to man to provide those things, God is just going to simply come in and just take it away. Because that's God. He's the one in control. He's the one in charge. And it may seem like they're going to lean heavily on this false sense of security. We have a king, we have a nation, we have an army, we have support, we have supply. We're going to lean heavily on that. And what is God going to do? Just take it away. Just like that. No problem for him. Which gives us that main message. When we rely on people, a lot of times for all the things that God is supplying, then there will always be a problem. So even as leadership, even as leaders in our families, in our homes, in our whatever, the support has to come from God. The leadership has to come from God. And we're just vessels of that. We're instruments of that leadership, and we shouldn't forget that. But God will just simply take it away. Look at verse 2. It says, the mighty man, he'll take those away. The warrior, the judge, the prophet, the diviner, the elder, the captain of 50, the honorable men, the counselor, the expert of artisan, the skillful enchanter, gone. God's just going to take them away. He's going to remove them without any problems at all. Look at verse 4. He says, and I will make mere lads your princes, right? And children will rule over them. And the people will be oppressed. Okay, so the condemnation on Israel is that they have gone so far that they were oppressing the poor. And God is saying, you are all going to be oppressed. There's going to be a problem for all of you. It doesn't matter who you are, rich or poor, great or small, you will all be oppressed. And then he says in verse 5, and the people will be oppressed, each one by another, and each one by their neighbor. And the youth will storm against the elder, and the inferior against the honorable. So, God can take power away from mighty people. He doesn't have a problem with that. And he's going to. He can. But look what he's doing. He's taking power away from the mighty people, the people of honor, the elders. He's taking power away from the mighty. And who's he giving it to? Children, which just symbolize unskilled people, unfit, fickle, unstable. Right? I'm sorry about that. I know we have children in here, but I'm sorry, but you are fickle and unstable and unskilled. That's just the way it works. But that's what God's going to do. He's going to take the people who have no skill and have no leadership, have no experience, and he's going to make them ruler over the others. What is that going to do? It's going to cause a lot of problems. Right? What happens in a family, in a nation, in any circumstance when the youth are in control? What's I was saying it right now? Okay, yeah. I mean, it's a shame, but it's a reality. And a lot of times, because those who are youthful, and when I say youthful, it could be anybody from teenagers to 20s, 30s, even 40s, really. We're talking about this group of people that are unskilled. They don't have the life skills that the honorable, the elder, the experienced warrior would have. They don't have those skills. They haven't listened to wise counsel, but they're stepping up to the plate and they're saying, I want to be in control. I want to rule. I want this to happen. I want that to happen. And you all better follow us because we're the majority. And what tends to happen to a group where that happens? Chaos. Yeah, every single time. It is never good. Does that ever happen in the church? Anywhere? Now, granted, we want our young folks to grow up and take on the mantle of leadership, but what do? How do they do that? Do we just hand the reins over? No. Yeah, we nurture them, right, and bring them up, and we teach them to honor the honorable, the elder, the skilled. and so what God is doing here is he's turning that whole system upside down. And this is a common thing. It's not just something that's unique to the situation. It happens in our world. It happens in our nation. It happens all the time. And so we just have to be careful of it. But that's what God is doing. He is turning this upside down to where the unskilled, the fickle, the unstable are going to rule. And the honorable and the elders are going to be the ones who are going to suffer. And the whole nation is going to suffer. That's true. That's right. He's never been afraid to go to the extreme to make things right. And the result of all of this is going to be oppression, it's going to be poor, and it's going to be chaos, like was mentioned before. Now, look at verse 6. It continues. It goes on. It says, when a man lays hold of his brother in his father's house, say, you have a cloak, you shall be our ruler. and these ruins will be under your charge. Who wants that job, right? It's like, hey, that guy over there, he's of the right family. He's got a cloak, he's got a place of honor. Let's go grab him from his house and let's go put him as ruler, and maybe things will get better. Maybe we can fix this. Maybe we can turn the tides. Maybe we can make things better. And what this message is teaching is Israel has gone too far. They have gone too far in the wrong direction. And they're desperate. They see what's happening. They know what's going on. They know the end result. They don't know how to fix it. They're grasping for straws. They grab the first person they see. They want to make him ruler. And they basically look over and they say, okay, here, all the ruins of Israel, that's yours now. You're in control. Nobody wants that job. And then he says in verse 7, he will protest on that day. Of course he does. Saying, I will not be your healer. And it's just a way of saying, I can't fix this. I may have the cloak, I may have the position, I may be of the right household, I might have all the skills, but at some point, Israel is going to get to a place, and already has in this story, where even those who could rule won't rule because they have gone so far that the people cannot see a way out. They don't see a way that they could fix the ruins of Israel. And that's where the problem is. And he says, for in my house there are neither bread nor cloak. You shall not appoint me ruler over the people. So even they are feeling the pinch of this oppression. Nobody wants to captain the sinking ship, right? Nobody wants to take charge of something that's already destined to fail.
Everybody must be leader
Until. That's right. And it's kind of ironic because prior to this, being a leader was an honorable place. It was a place of desired status. They wanted that place. They wanted to be recognized. And now the people have gone so far and had such fickle leadership that nobody wants to touch the thing. Nobody wants that place. Nobody wants to hold that responsibility. It's too difficult for them. Look at verse 8. He says, for Jerusalem has stumbled and Judah has fallen because their speech and their actions are against who? The Lord. The Lord. To rebel against his glorious presence. Now this is kind of a way of saying, if you read through the text, you'll see that God has been talking to Israel from really the time of captivity on, that he will make them a great nation, and he will put his name in their midst, or his name will go before them. His name will be in the temple. And that really signifies God's presence and his reputation, that he will be present. And so the idea is, here we have this great nation that has the presence of God, but what are they doing? They're rebelling against the gracious presence of God. And it says the expression of their faces bear witness against them. You can just imagine what they look like at this point. They display their sin like Sodom. They don't even conceal it. Woe to them, for they have brought evil on themselves. So we've had this discussion several times, and I keep bringing it up because it keeps coming up in the text. But I think it's worth noting. And it's a question that we ask ourselves, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? What comes first? Is it corrupt leadership that corrupts the people, or is it corrupt people who appoint corrupt leadership? What do you think? Yeah, anarchy wherever you go. And it's hard to know for certain because sometimes we see the people corrupting themselves and appointing corrupt leadership, and then the cycle continues. Sometimes we see corrupt leadership coming to power and corrupting the people, and it's just a vicious cycle. And the more corrupt the people get, the more difficult it is to find righteous people to serve and take care of the people. And priorities start to fall apart, and the standards get lower and lower and lower and lower, to the point where they're willing to pick anybody they can possibly find to claim leadership. And that never ends well. It is not a good place to be. And so we see that in our nation too, don't we? We see it all the time. As the nation laxes itself in values, right? As they begin to accept things that are ungodly and unholy, the more the nation does that, guess where those people are going to go come voting time? Why? Why are those the kind of people who are going to rush to the polls? Why do you think? The people whose morals become laxed, and they get to a point where they want something and they're not getting it, and yeah, they want to continue. Yeah. And I think that's so true. Unfortunately, the ones who have something to say, are going to be the ones who rush to the polls and try to vote in somebody that they think is going to support their lifestyle. And that happens a lot. Unfortunately, that happens more than we would like it to.
Unfortunately, we don't stand up for the truth sometimes.
Yeah.
Those things get voted in by voting 2-1 because we didn't vote.
That's true. That's true. We become comfortable being the minority. That tends to be the case. We're used to it. We're used to people around us having, different morals than us. We're used to people going against God, and we're just kind of accustomed to that. And so when it comes down to that time when we need to act, they're the ones who are going to rush in. And we're the ones who are kind of like, my vote doesn't count, doesn't really matter. But in all reality, a lot of these lessons teach us that when the people start to fade, when they start to go, they begin to appoint leaders that are going to champion their position, and it's a vicious, vicious, ugly cycle that has to be stopped. Thankfully, in this story, there's actually somebody who steps up, but we'll get to him in just a minute. But in verse 10 of this chapter 3, let's continue reading. It says, "Say to the righteous that it will go well with them." Okay? So yes, there's going to be some problems. Yes, they're going to be part of this whole thing, and they're going to certainly suffer in many ways. But God wants Isaiah to tell the righteous that things will be good for them, that they're not going to be overlooked, that they will eat the fruit of their actions, that consequences of their actions will be noticed, that they will be recognized by God in some way. But then he says, "Woe to the wicked, it will go badly for them, for what he deserves will be done for him." So covenant faithfulness is going to be rewarded and rebellion is going to be punished. But that doesn't mean, and I keep rephrasing that and reiterating that because I think it's really important, it doesn't mean that the righteous aren't going to have trouble during this time. It's certainly going to be troubling times. But there's something that the righteous have that the wicked don't. Okay, so we've been talking about Isaiah's message, and it's a message of judgment and a message of what? Support, and starts with an H. Hope, right? That's Isaiah's message. It's a message of judgment, no doubt, but it's also a message of hope. And so what the righteous have that the wicked do not have is what? Hope. Hope. And that's what's going to keep them going and fuel them for the future. Look at verse 12. He says, "O my people, their oppressors are children, and women rule over them." And so in this culture, obviously, children and women are considered, in most cases, the, I hate to use that term, but the weaker of society. And the men are the ones who go to war and are the powerful in that culture. And in this case, that's not how it's going to be. It's basically saying that the weaker, the ones who need support, they're the ones who are going to control and run the show. I was talking to somebody recently. It was a congregation that, the men of this congregation, a large congregation, had chosen not to serve in leadership roles. They made that choice for some reason. I don't know why. And I've seen this before too. And so there were all these things that needed to be done. The men were kind of fickle in their attitude. So guess who stepped up and took control? It happens a lot because somebody's got to be in control, right? And so we see that in certain circumstances where when one person doesn't step up, somebody else is going to. Somebody's going to step up because leadership is needed. Okay? And so I've seen that in congregations. I think you've probably seen that in congregations. And it happens. That's what's happening here. The men are becoming weak. They're afraid. They're not in a position of power. And so the weaker of them, still then again using that term in a very respectful way, but nonetheless in their society, that's how they're viewed, are the ones who are going to step up and take control. And God says, "Oh, my people, those who guide you lead you astray and confuse the direction of your path." And so those people who are supposed to be your guides, your shepherds, your leaders, are actually leading you astray. And the very people that God has put in place to make the pathway right and straight and easy to find, they're making it very confusing and very difficult. So once again, we have that word that comes up, chaos. There's chaos in the midst.
Back in these days, women were afraid of knowing what they are.
Yeah, I think it's true.
This day and time, most women are educated.
Mm-hmm.
Either already educated from a mother, or grandmother, or somebody else, or they went to school somewhere.
Right.
So, is it our fault that they learn so much?
You're getting down some really...
And is it all in the family, the breakdown of the American family?
Of withholding or upholding the male leadership role in the family. There's a good chance that not stepping up and being men certainly causes a family to suffer. I think that's very true.
Obama even said, what's wrong with this? There's no family members at home in the black race,
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
It happens in the men and the white race.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I think one of the challenges that we have in the church today is that the leadership structure in the Bible does not mirror our society.
Mm-hmm.
I want my daughter to have enormous opportunity.
Right. Absolutely.
I want her to be able to follow whatever career aspirations, dreams,
Right.
whatnot, and that's great. It's an awesome time that in our society that young ladies are having the opportunities to do these kinds of things, and we encourage that. But the role of men in the Bible and in the example that we have in the Bible is different than what our society says.
That's right.
So it is one of the challenges that we have in the church today. We've talked about that in the eldership. That's one of the reasons why we had the class that we did before, is that it has nothing to do with one
That's right.
gender being more or less important.
That's right.
It's a matter of trying to follow the biblical example that we have in the Bible, and that can be a real trick.
That's right.
Not a trick, but a trick.
Yeah.
Challenge, I guess is the way I would say it. To follow that example, and at the same time, not diminish the role of women.
Right. It's the whole Ephesians chapter 4 section that we've talked about so many times, that talks about, you're going to say? Yeah.
Because today's world, those outside of the church, they don't understand the man that chooses to deal with it. Men don't want to be leaders.
Yeah.
Men do not want to be leaders of their home.
Yeah.
And fortunately, my late husband and Johnny were both very strong men. And from that perspective, and the ladies in our class,
Mm-hmm.
whether in the church or in the home, is the best job in town.
Yeah.
If her husband loves her the way Christ loves
That's the key. That's right. And that's what that Ephesians chapter 4 section.
her.
Yeah.
And
Right. Sacrificial kind of love. Yeah.
can't get away
Right.
from that whole concept of there is a hierarchy.
Yeah.
And God placed us where He is.
That's right. That's right. And, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Did really well in her career, and yet you, when we got married, she told me, she said, you're leaving.
Yeah.
And that's what we gotta teach our kids, our kids that have to with her.
Right. And I think Joe's point's valid, and we've talked about this several times, and it's always something that gets really confused.
The thing is, we always talk, and I agree with 100% with everything you just said, obviously. But one of the things that what is a person going to see when they come and worship with us, let's say for the first time and they haven't grown up in the church? We always say, well, we don't do this, that's one of the first things
Yeah.
they see.
Right.
But you know what? One of the things that they're seeing a lot more now than they might have to say, wait a minute, you don't have a woman leading a prayer.
Right.
You don't have a woman leading this. And that is a real shell shock to people
Sure.
who are not used to in today's society. So we have to be willing to do what you're describing and educate people that we're not backwards. It's not that we're trying to diminish the role.
Yeah.
We're just trying to follow the example of Christ and what's put in the church of the New Testament.
Right. And I said Ephesians 4.
We can talk about that, all of us within the confines of this building, and we're preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
We have to be, are we going to answer
Mm-hmm.
on the day of judgment for not spreading this message outside these walls?
Yeah.
Can I speak as a Methodist?
Sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I feel like I'm so refreshed coming over here. And so I feel like also people who feel the way that we're touched about through the time need to be able to stand up and not apologize for it, because it's so nice coming over here and not feeling like all that crud. And so I don't feel like it needs to have the apologies of like, this is a different time, because as a slippery slope that my church is in, this is a different time than the Bible, so like it's a different interpretation. You've got to be really careful from that, or you're going to be like the Methodist church.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate that very much, and thank you
I
for
love y'all's church.
thank you for commenting on that. I know this is a difficult conversation for you to even hear, because we're talking about this, but
The difficulty for me to hear this is that y'all feel bad about it.
yeah.
And it's very nice.
Yeah, and we certainly believe in men stepping up to a leadership role. I think that's a godly example. Ephesians chapter 5 was the one I was thinking of, actually, not chapter 4. But Joe's point's very valid, and I think it's one that needs to be stand up. We're not talking about greater and lesser in value at all. We're not saying that men are greater in value than women, or women are greater than value than men. We're equals, but we have different roles, and that's a different story. But for some reason, when people hear that, they say, oh, you think women are lesser. No, not at all. In fact, very much necessary for a family unit to exist. And each has their own roles. But through this whole study of leadership, I hope we recognize that the leadership model consists of what two main characteristics? What are the two major tenets of leadership? Authority and what? Submission. And it's not one is greater than the other, right? Because in that whole model, what do we have? We have men submitting to leadership of Christ. That's what Ephesians chapter 5 talks about. Women submitting to the God-given leadership of men. And then men treating women as Christ treats the church in a sacrificial kind of love. That's not greater and lesser than. That is putting everybody on the same plane but giving us different roles. The problem is when those roles get confused, nobody knows what to do. And it gets so messy and so difficult. And I feel for the Methodist Church. I know that they've had a lot of struggles with that.
It's really sad, but it's
Yeah.
our church.
Yeah, it is. But you can see how far it can go. And so I know we've gotten that was a good discussion, leadership. way off what I was going to talk about, but that's okay. So anyway, so part of what is happening with Israel is their roles are being confused. Okay, the children are taking control. The men who are supposed to be in control are not. The ones who are supposed to be leading the people in the right direction are leading them astray. It's a whole jumbled up mess. The whole thing is collapsing and falling apart. But there's a glimmer of hope in Isaiah chapter 6, and we have a little bit of time. But there's a glimmer of hope in Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah has this great vision. I'm just going to tell you about it because I won't have time to read it. But he has this awesome vision. It's a heavenly vision. He's so afraid because he's in the presence of God, but he's afraid because he is a man of unclean lips, of a people of unclean lips. He knows he's part of this group, and he's not participating, but he's part of it, and he's afraid of what God's going to do to him because of his guilt by association. And so he's terrified in the presence of God. And he says, woe is me. I'm done, right? And then what happens? The seraphim fly down with two wings and cover up the face with the other, and takes that hot coal and touches it to the lips of Isaiah. And instead of burning Isaiah, what does it do? Purifies him. And it's a really amazing story, because I want you to think about that coal as Jesus, right? We have God's holiness confined in this coal. That's what I believe this is supposed to be implying. And it touches the lips of Isaiah, which would normally be judgment, and it should burn him, but instead of burning him, it purifies him. And then in chapter 7, he gives this great message of Emmanuel. And what does that phrase mean? Emmanuel? God with us, right? The reason that's so powerful is because suddenly to be in the presence of God is not going to be dangerous, because the person who becomes the Emmanuel is who? Jesus. God in the flesh. And people are going to be able to approach God through Emmanuel, and it's really a beautiful imagery. But he gets down to the very end of that, chapter 6, at the very end, close to the end, and he starts talking about the burning down and the cutting down of a tree. Very symbolic of judgment of a nation. Babylon's going to be cut down, so on and so forth. So Israel is going to be cut down like a tree. And it says in verse 13, yet there will be a 10th portion in it, and it will again be subject to burning like a terebinth or an oak. And he says, whose stump remains. That's actually good news. When it is felled, because from the stump comes the holy seed. And so we have this smoldering, burnt stump that God has cut down, but then from it comes, it's a little glimmer of hope, but it's a tiny seed that begins to grow. And Isaiah's message is chocked full of that idea, the imagery that God is going to do something different. Throughout the text, he hints of redeeming Jerusalem. In other words, redeeming a people. He talks about a future leadership, a future king who will come and rule the people into justice and faithfulness. He talks about Emmanuel. We've already discussed that. He talks about in Isaiah 53, a great servant who comes. And instead of being rebellious to God, serves God faithfully and even dies for the people. And through his death comes victory and life. There's a wonderful chapter. But in between there, we have this story about Hezekiah. You remember Hezekiah? So was he a good king or a bad king? What do you think? Hezekiah. He's on the fence, right? I mean, he starts off really good, right? Because when he first comes on the scene, Hezekiah, you can read about him in Isaiah 36 and 37. So Hezekiah comes on the scene, and, his person that came before him did evil in the sight of God. And so God removes him, he dies. Hezekiah comes in and he starts this restoration of Israel. He starts tearing down the idols and removing all of the high places, getting rid of all the idol worship, turning back to God. Things are looking awesome with Hezekiah's leadership. And in fact, when Hezekiah hears about Assyria coming, now his previous king, when he heard Assyria was coming, guess what he did? He made a covenant with the king of Assyria and said, hey, guys, if you leave us alone, we'll partner with you and we can be buddies, right? And how well did that end? That end well for... No, not at all. And so Hezekiah comes on the scene and he says, absolutely not. So the same thing happens, right? They send a representative. Assyria sends a representative. They say, hey, let's be buddies like we were with the last king. And Hezekiah says, not a chance. And the first thing he does is pray to his God for deliverance. And that's such a powerful message. I encourage you to read that, Isaiah 36 and 37. He prays to God for deliverance. And in the midst of Assyria's attack, Assyria is attacking and he's in the temple praying. Could you imagine that? What would it look like if our president, in the midst of a massive attack, just hid himself in a closet and prayed? Well, that's what Hezekiah is doing. He's hiding in the temple, not hiding, but he's praying in the temple. And guess what God does? What's that? He sends the angel of the Lord. 180,000 Assyrians wiped out, just like that. So when the people woke up, they were all dead. So they go home limping because, they can't find any way to, fight against this group that has a God that is so powerful that can wipe out 180 some odd fighting soldiers overnight. But that's Hezekiah's leadership. That's Hezekiah's faith. Now, Hezekiah made one fatal mistake, and we'll just real quick, all right, just bear with me real fast. Hezekiah made one fatal mistake. Remember, he became deathly ill, prayed to God. God said, okay, I'll give you 15 more years, probably the worst thing that ever happened to him. So as he's getting well, this little nation called Babylon, that's over, kind of north of or south of Assyria, they send representatives with gifts to the king Hezekiah and said, sorry you're sick, I'm glad you're getting well. And Hezekiah says, hey, while you're here, come look at all my treasure in my temple. And Isaiah comes in and says, hey, what did you show him? And Hezekiah said, I showed him everything. Everything I have, I showed him. And guess what? That little unknown place, Babylon, that's just now getting its roots, becomes a great nation. And guess what happens to the southern kingdom? Falls to the great king Nebuchadnezzar. But it's a powerful story of leadership.
One thing from the aspect that we can look at, we could be talking about 2023 movies and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Nations are joining together.
Oh, sure.
Each other. I won't hurt you if you want to hurt me, and let's go against this thing.
Yeah.
And let us pray hard, because this shows that the power of prayer does work.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
let us end on this. Let us go home and pray that these men and women.
That's right.
God demands us to be, not that He asks us to be, that He demands us to be.
That's right. That's right. And on that note, let's go ahead and close with a prayer. Father, we're so grateful for the message of Isaiah. We're grateful for the judgment, and we're grateful for the hope. And we pray that we can be the righteous remnant, Father, that look forward to the day that you will purify your land and your people and bring about the redemption that you have so promised throughout your word over and over again. We trust you, Father, for all that we have. We trust you for support. But Father, help us to pray and to recognize that the leadership model consists of authority and submission, that you have put people in authority. And then for us to submit to that authority is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. It is a sign of leadership. It is the model that you created for us. Help us to honor that with all of our heart and our families and our communities and our church, to, as Johnny has pointed out, to be the men that we are called to be the women that we're called to be, to champion that model so that your truth will be honored and that your church will prevail. Thank you for all that you bless us with. Thank you especially for your Son, the purification we have through him, the access to you that we have through him. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.